Question Lane. Solving problems through the process of questions and answers.
Welcome to the Question Lane. That's the name of the podcast, where the goal is to solve problems through the process of questions and answers. Today's guest is Professor Emeritus of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. Politics and economics will be the focus of today's discussion, and specifically your article in the Communities and Banking publication on the importance of entrepreneurship in Black and Latino communities in Massachusetts. And if time allows us to get through this interview, I'll also try to get to your other interview where you talked about gentrification in Massachusetts. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Alonso. My pleasure.
Is there a specific name you want me to call you by, or will Dr. Jennings?
James is fine. Dr. Jennings, whatever is more comfortable to you.
Perfect. I'll just go with Dr. Jennings.
Okay.
Is there anything you want us to know about you before we get started?
Well, in terms of the gentrification piece, I have just helped the city of Boston, and it's not completely over yet, but I've assisted the city of Boston, in particular the Boston Housing Authority and the city's Department of Neighborhood Development, write its 5-year affirmatively furthering fair housing market plan. And in that report, required by HUD, we have focused a lot on displacement and gentrification and how fair housing could be one tool towards reducing displacement and preventing gentrification in some of Boston's neighborhoods.
Okay. So is it accurate to say that you're a Black male?
Yeah, I'm Black male, but I also have Latino descent. I'm actually Afro-Rican, African-American, and Puerto Rican.
Okay. So why did you become a professor in planning, and why did you gain an interest in gentrification and economic development?
Right. Well, I've always I've been in higher education for 40 years now, and even before higher education, I was very much involved in a range of community issues in Bedford-Stuyvesant, New York City, around housing, youth, and I understood early on the connection between not just policy, but also knowledge that drives policy in resolving some of these challenges. And one of the things that I've been concerned about, and still am, is the fact that policy sometimes overlooks the experiences of people on the ground level. Grassroots experiences are sometimes completely overlooked, where in places like the Ivory Tower where knowledge is produced. And so my attraction, let me say, to higher education and teaching really was driven by, in my opinion, the critical importance of connecting knowledge with the actual experiences of people at a grassroots level. And if that is missing, in my opinion, then we open the door to very paternalistic ways of thinking about these problems and how they might be resolved. And we also easily slip into paternalistic and even racist views of people who we see as victims, but in fact are in the front lines of helping resolve some of these social and economic challenges facing our cities.
So if I could just rephrase that, it sounds to me as if you were very interested in explaining some of the circumstances that people went through that don't necessarily always have a seat at the table in terms of making decisions that affect their lives, and you wanted to be able to speak from that perspective. Is that accurate?
Exactly. That's quite accurate.
Perfect. So one of the articles that you wrote about gentrification, I noticed that the word racism was listed once and inequality was listed 4 times. This was the 17-page article that you wrote in the University of Massachusetts, Boston Charter Review. So I just wanted to know, when you use the word inequality, what exactly do you mean?
Well, I use inequality at the same time that I use the term inequities. Inequality is a very fundamental concept that refers to an uneven distribution of resources. It could be educational resources, economic resources, even political resources, informational resources, educational resources, where we see in society a hierarchy. And many times this is a racial hierarchy in addition to a class hierarchy, where certain groups on the top are in a sense way more equal than certain groups, in particular black and brown people, on the bottom of this hierarchy of resources. So inequality has to do with the fact that resources are not evenly distributed. But in addition to inequality, there's also inequity. And inequity is linked to how equality and inequality are defined and pursued. To have an equal society, in a sense, does not necessarily resolve inequities in society, because after years of economic oppression, years of, let's say, for example, redlining in many of our local communities, after decades of perpetuating and sustaining inequality along this racial and class hierarchy, in order to resolve that today, we can't simply say, okay, now everyone starts at the same line. There has to be some acknowledgement that inequality has generated inequities over economic inequities over generations. So to me, we cannot talk about inequality absent the equity lens.
I appreciate that explanation, because my definition was a maldistribution of resource as a result of incorrect treatment on a racial and economic level. And you basically summed that up in a nutshell.
Yes, I
also, no, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I agree with your more eloquent summary, actually.
No, I'm not. No, you're the expert. So another word that I like to focus on in conversations about racism is justice. And justice to me is the goal, should be the goal that black people and other non-white people focus on in this type of situation where we're dealing with racism. So my definition for justice is derived from Neely Fuller Jr., which is first part is guaranteeing that no person is mistreated. And then the second part is guaranteeing that the persons that need the most help get the most constructive help. So do you believe that is an accurate definition of justice, or what's your opinion on that?
Oh no, that is. I agree with you. Justice is such a. It's not just a value. It's a way of organizing things. It's a way of distributing things. It's a way of acknowledging that, again, we have a history of inequality and inequities, and only a framework of social justice will move us forward. And this is not just at the individual level. We have movements in this country that have been built upon the pursuit of social justice. Perhaps the most prominent is the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was not simply, as Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us and others, simply sitting at the counter, although that was, very important as a start. It was also making sure that, as I used the phrase years ago, that we not just get a piece of the pie, but we also help determine the flavor of the pie, the baker, the ingredients, that we really are substantive partners, equal partners, as the nation moves forward. And the way you describe justice is something that many people have come to acknowledge. The United Nations, for example, has established frameworks for understanding what social and economic justice is. Many philosophers have looked at justice and approached this, again, as a critical component of a fair society, of an equal society, of a society that has overcome its inequities. People in this country, in this society, do not start at the same place. The race is not fair when people start that race, and we have to acknowledge that. Even Lyndon Baines Johnson, the President Lyndon Baines Johnson, in his speech to the Howard University graduates in 1964, asserted similarly. To say everyone is going to start at the same line and all of a sudden we have an equal society, that is actually quite ahistorical, and it's not going to move us forward because it does not infuse in our strategies and our politics that notion, that value of justice.
Okay, so can you briefly explain what gentrification is and the effects that it has on non-white people?
Yes. So gentrification is a major problem facing urban America in many places, and it's actually, as you look at the literature on gentrification, it's defined in very different ways depending on the particular locality. I take issue with gentrification that is defined so broadly that it overlooks some specific characteristics in various cities. In Boston, because I'm familiar with Boston, the way I would define gentrification is a displacement of longtime residents, and these are Black and Latino people for the most part, some Asian residents as well, but the displacement of longtime residents by an infusion of wealthier, very predominantly, white households. And I emphasize longtime residents because these are urban spaces that people have been organizing around, living, residing in, fighting to improve the quality of community life. And we have a situation where, due to certain economic pressures, like major developments, for example, certain areas, neighborhood areas in Boston are becoming very, very unstable, not just for renters, but also homeowners and also small neighborhood businesses due to evictions, due to increasing rents with no justification, and also defining affordability for groups that are higher up the economic status than groups lower on the economic status. And so gentrification in Boston is very complex, but it is associated with displacement. And you have a situation where areas of the city that were once predominantly Black, culturally rich, are becoming now vulnerable. And institutions, community-based organizations that have worked with, again, longtime residents in these areas are also beginning to falter in a sense. And so the face of Boston is in danger of becoming, a very different face than what we've known it as, with warts and everything.
I appreciate you explaining that definition and putting in context what it means when there's an infusion of capital by, wealthier white families. But I also want you to talk about the role that cities, states, and government played in creating this dynamic where people that are non-white lived in areas for an extended period of time but didn't obtain ownership. Can you explain like redlining and
Yes.
things of that nature and how it affected non-white people?
Right. And you cannot, as we think and discuss this issue, it's impossible to leave the role of government out. Government has been perhaps not. Some people might say it wasn't intentional, but whether it's intentional or unintentional, the role of government has carried a lot of weight in the challenge of gentrification and displacement today. But in terms of both federal, local, and also the private sector, redlining is basically an approach that involves a formal or informal designation of areas based on race or ethnicity, not exclusively, I have to say, because there's some instances around in urban history where white communities have also been displaced as a result of the same government forces. But for the most part, this has involved black and brown people. And so redlining is a formal or informal designation of areas based on race or ethnicity where, in particular, mortgage loans would not be offered or at much higher costs. And so banks, with the support of government, federal government, state government, local government, would designate certain areas for economic disinvestment. And lo and behold, those areas, for the most part, in many northern cities, were black areas, and in some cases, black and Latino areas. When I say that the federal government supported this, we can go back to the 1935 Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which actually issued what they called at that time residential security maps. And these were maps that forewarned bankers and investors that this area may not be economically productive. And the reason is, again, because these were areas predominated by black residents. Mind you, a lot of these areas were economically vibrant, albeit in a segregationist framework. They had cultural institutions. People were working as hard as any other group in American society to do the best for their children and to move forward economically. But because of racism, because black people were the other, these areas were arbitrarily redlined. I have to emphasize, however, Alonzo, that to focus on redlining solely is inaccurate. Really, there are three parts to this story. One is redlining, as I just described. The other part, or the other leg of the stool of economic and land disposition and oppression, is restrictive zoning. And so in addition to redlining certain areas, local and state governments also instituted zoning that would, in effect, prevent blacks and Latinos in places like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, to move out of these redline areas into, let me say, so-called better areas, which were predominantly white. And they could be in the same city or in the same suburbs, but restrictive zoning was used to prevent certain kinds of homes, certain kinds of businesses, and a lot of times these are directly connected to how do we stop blacks from coming here. And actually, in some cases, restrictive zoning also had to do with jobs that were available. As whites moved to the suburbs, we also have industry being established in the suburbs. Whites can get to those jobs because housing was available to them. But if you restrict housing, and it could be intentional or unintentional, it could be obvious or not obvious, but the impact is blacks are not allowed to come into these areas. What that means is blacks are not allowed or do not have access to those same jobs, because jobs and housing are very, very much connected in many places. But that's the second leg, restrictive zoning. Today we start seeing the face of the third leg, and that is zoning decisions in cities benefiting big developers for the most part at the expense of longtime residents. And so in a place like Boston, you have these areas that have been redlined for decades. All of a sudden, big developers are getting waivers, zoning waivers, to build luxury housing in these same areas because land is cheaper and it's easier to just move people, out with evictions or just increasing rents arbitrarily. And so in Boston, we're engaged in a fight to ensure that zoning, this particular leg of zoning, is not utilized to contribute to displacement. So when we talk about redlining, we also have to talk about the two other legs, and that's restrictive zoning, like can't get to the suburbs or to certain parts in the same city, and also today's zoning decisions that benefit big developers interested in building luxury homes for the most part and raising rents, which results in people needing to move out of areas that for generations they resided in, and for generations they and their families struggled to make the community better.
I'm glad you brought up the restrictive zoning because what comes to mind is sports stadiums also being developed in these black areas and non-white areas. For example, in Los Angeles,
right.
There is the I think it's the Los Angeles Rams Stadium being constructed in Inglewood, California, if I'm not mistaken, and it's displacing a lot of residents.
Right. And the same thing has happened in Atlanta in a major way. In cities really across America, because it's an argument that says this land can be put to better use economically, regardless of the history of the land, the history of longtime residents on this particular land.
You also brought up development of luxury condominiums and housing. Can you also talk about the city and state's role in developing highways through a lot of these black areas? For example, in Florida, in Miami, most black people used to live in a part of town called Overtown, and that was considered the Harlem of the South in the early 1950s and 40s. But they developed highway systems that went through these communities and kind of decimated the central business district. And this has occurred throughout the country. I'm pretty sure in New York and Boston as well. Can you explain how these type of situations aid in the wealth gap expanding?
Well, for sure, and you're right. There's a history about this approach that you're describing, building highways through, communities that were actually, they were still, they may have been economically distressed, but they would still struggle to make those communities better on the part of residents. But I should add, here in Boston, there was a major victory because a highway through a predominantly black neighborhood, Roxbury, also parts of South End, which abuts Roxbury. Years ago, it was proposed that a major highway just be cut across all of these communities. But people from different communities came together. It was a multiracial coalition that was able to stop the idea, in a sense, that a highway was going to be good for residents in the city of Boston. And so I'm sure there are other victories around the country, but at the same time, there are too many instances where highways were used not to disseminate white communities, but again, black and Latino communities. And these are communities where people were raising families, people were supporting cultural institutions, people were trying to struggle to make communities better on the framework of both challenging inequality and inequities. So highways, were very destructive because they were not pursued in a balanced way. We could build highways but they should be pursued in a balanced way where the future of all people, regardless of race or national origins, can be taken into account. In fact, the term that was used with highways and urban renewal when highways first started to really get bumped under the Eisenhower administration was Negro removal. This term was closely associated with the building of highways. It was really about Negro removal, highways, and urban renewal. And the justification, of course, is an economic one. It's, people have to get the jobs, this and that. But that justification, that economic justification, has to be evaluated through a lens of racial hierarchy again, a lens where on the basis of race, we did not have equality in the society. On the basis of race, we had major inequities. So even today, people may justify economic strategies without putting on the table a lens to look at racial inequality and inequity, and it will create the same kind of problems in terms of displacing people, in terms of being not in the best interest of moving a city forward where any group can advance forward.
Are you familiar with the term supercommuting?
Yes. There's been. Mm-hmm.
No, go ahead.
Well, this touches upon a big challenge in urban areas around transportation and public transportation. And so there's been, I don't know the latest technology, but there's been, a lot of focus on how to deal with some of the problems that are facing cities by improving transportation that can take people, farther distances, less costs, and in more efficient ways. Public transportation is something that in many cities, including here in Boston, has been a big challenge, has been a big problem. People can't, even within the city, people can't really get around in the most efficient way, and it's getting costlier and costlier. And unless cities figure out how to move people from let's say, in this area, Framingham, which I think is maybe 25 miles to the west of Boston, or Lawrence, which is maybe another 25 miles to the north of Boston. I mean, transportation should be, the state of technology of transportation should be such where people can make those long distances, again, in clean, efficient, and not very costly ways. So that's sort of approach as a way to deal with the housing issue, with the fact that housing, affordable housing, is becoming harder and harder to achieve in a lot of cities.
Can you briefly explain how the stress of being gentrified out of a community and having to supercommute 2 hours or 3 hours per day getting to your job, how can that affect your mental state and your economic outlook?
Right. Well, in fact, a number of people, and after our talk, I could give you the name of a scholar in the area who is actually looking at the public health consequences of gentrification, but also these long commute times. If you're raising a family, having to commute 2 hours to get to a job and to get back home each way, that becomes a family issue. We're not supporting families when that has to happen. When you look at the impact on schools, it means that parent cannot really focus on holding local schools accountable in a full way because she or he, is spending a lot of time, transporting to a job and back and forth. So in addition to public health, the stress, there's probably an impact on public schools and how parents can hold public schools accountable for the education of their children. The cost, again, these are not minimal costs. These are major costs that families, households have to use to take away from income that could be used for savings, that could be used for a number of other things that might be more economically productive.
I definitely agree with that. Super commuting definitely could be a stress way to live, considering you having a family and trying to save up for retirement and just trying to survive. So
and how do you deal with that situation where, okay, my child got ill in school, and my child, I have a second grader or a third grader or a kindergartner or a middle school kid, and so how do I get to that school so I can take care of my child when I'm 2 hours away, and I don't drive. I have to depend on transportation, public transportation. But even if I have a car and drive, that's still, that has a lot of stress. That has a lot of stress to families.
You also talked about the importance of entrepreneurship for non-white people to kind of combat some of these situations with gentrification. Can you briefly explain the importance of entrepreneurship and how do we go about actually putting some of these suggestions into practice?
Yes, for sure. So we cannot forget that a healthy neighborhood, a vibrant community has to have also a vibrant business sector, small business sector. These little small businesses that have made a commitment to open shop in neighborhoods, working class neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that are economically distressed, they provide an important economic resource, not just in terms of they're there and they're it's a positive happening on a piece of physical space, but they also hire workers and they also buy things, and so they become small businesses and even micro enterprises, businesses that is with 5 employees or less. In many areas, are the economic engine that builds a local workforce, but also allows wealth to be recycled in the neighborhood. And that recycling of wealth is a critical piece in building wealth. And so small businesses, when we talk about gentrification, we cannot forget about the destructive effects of commercial gentrification, because rising rents that are instituted arbitrarily, again, hurt renters and homeowners, but they also hurt the small businesses. And so my concern with the topic of entrepreneurship is basically that we don't teach enough about entrepreneurship to our young people. And so when I wrote the piece for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston in their journal a few years ago, I basically was critical of the public school system, of the Boston public school system, because I did not see anything in the curriculum of the Boston public school system or any messages that entrepreneurship is something to teach our children. It's important to teach entrepreneurship because this doesn't involve just how to start a business. I mean, that's basic, of course. How do we start a business? How to maintain a business? That's certainly a part of entrepreneurship. But entrepreneurship for young people is also helping them to think critically about the opportunities around them to help them see resources and assets around them that could be tapped, not just to run a business, but to also help people and strengthen the community. And this was when I wrote the piece, I was frustrated because in Boston there's actually a strong, vibrant history of entrepreneurship in the Black community, and that's not even being taught, So people who made major breakthroughs in the business community in Boston, who happen to be Black, our young people don't know about them. But it goes beyond a history lesson, of course. It's also about how do we give opportunities to young people to take advantage in a positive way about what's around them. And if we could do that, if we teach entrepreneurship, then what we're actually doing is teaching to critical thinking skills. And critical thinking skills are far more important than learning any kind of facts that might be on a high-stakes test. And so when I wrote that piece, it was really just an encouragement for educators to begin looking at entrepreneurship and the importance for advocating for it in a school system which is about now 50% Latino and about 40% Black.
I also found it interesting how you spoke about the importance of diversification in industry, because some of the fields that non-white people were engaged in on an entrepreneurship front were service type of businesses, taxis and limousine companies and child care. How do we promote broader business sense and broader business participation in manufacturing and tech and things of that nature?
I think that's a very important question. And you're right. A lot of the emphasis when we look at our businesses, at least in Massachusetts, they are concentrated in certain industry subsectors. That's not a bad thing, because even within those industry sectors or subsectors, there's the opportunity for technological growth. For example, in transportation, taxis are in the transportation. It's a subsector in transportation. But transportation is also very much a technological field. So we have to figure out how to get young people to understand the technology of transportation, especially when their mom or pop are running a taxi or, some transportation-related service. We're fortunate that we do have young people in technology, and I say we're fortunate in Boston because there's so many institutions of higher education in this area, perhaps to a much greater extent than other areas. But we do have a cadre of young people of color who are going into technology and going into information services and software engineering. And so part of our challenge, collective challenge, is to connect these young people to potential opportunities in our communities, because they are a very enriching source of creativity and eagerness and enthusiasm, conjoined with the skills that are needed to sort of expand the entrepreneurial class in the Black community.
I definitely agree with your suggestion that if there is some type of, how should I describe this? Maybe some type of skill set or some type of competitive advantage in an industry like transportation. Maybe taking advantage of that skill set and developing that on the technological side would be something that we should do. There was a Black, I think he was a young man. I saw this article a couple weeks ago. There's a young man in London who has like a mobile barbershop, and it's all ran through an app. So something like that, or taking advantage of, what we already could do, but taking it to the 21st century would definitely be something I suggest.
And then we cannot forget the political piece. I mean, there's always the political piece in trying to figure out how do communities move forward. And so in addition to making these connections and encouraging young people to look at opportunities and to push critical thinking skills, among young people, the other thing that we have to look at is who our government works for, local government. And, at one level, our local government works for everyone, of course. That's not, no one is going to say this government is only for this group or that group. But when we look at the fact that in Boston last year, this is 2017, the city of Boston let out $600 million in city contracts. $600 million were let by the city of Boston for all kinds of businesses it needed. Less than 1% of that money went to black entrepreneurs or Latino entrepreneurs. Less than 1% in a city which is now majority black and Latino and Asian. And the city, I think, was embarrassed by this, but of course that's not enough. And so we also have to figure out, to give those young people opportunities, how to get them at the table when city officials or city bureaucrats are giving out $600 million worth of contracts, and less than 1% in this city goes to people of color. That's a big political problem that has to be addressed.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's our final topic, some solutions.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the reparations topic that's been brought up with the Democratic 2020 candidates?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Do you think reparations...
Well, I think as an idea, I think, yes, reparations is something that has to be on the table because there has to be an acknowledgement of how wealth was generated in this nation for hundreds of years on the back of slaves. I would even add that something closer to me as I digest the national discussion on reparations is how people I know and young people I know spent years in prison because they were caught smoking marijuana or selling a nickel bag of marijuana. So when we talk about reparations, to me, we have an excellent example of a group of people, for the most part, but not exclusively, black and Latino young men who went to prison. Their lives were destroyed because they were dealing in something which today in Massachusetts is legal, and today where people are going to be making hundreds of millions of dollars for by being involved in selling marijuana. I think when I think about reparations, that's the best example because any young person, any young black, Latino, really any young person who spent a year, I think of the Rockefeller laws in New York State where people were put up for years for minimal amount of possession, not anything, not selling, but just possession of marijuana. I think reparations should be targeted to them because we put you in jail, and it was hypocritical for us to put you in jail and destroy your economic future. And today, everything is just fine, and you want to buy some marijuana and make a lot of money and this and this and that. So I take that national discussion, and to me, I have to bring it down to what I see around me in terms of young people's lives that were destroyed. So if people need an example of how reparations could work concretely, I think that would be it. And so, but while that discussion is going on, again, there are a lot of things that I think can happen at the local level. And again, here I'm just using my Boston perspective. It may be different in other places, but in Boston, we certainly need tenant protections against this frenzy real estate development that is just focusing on luxury apartments. So I think we have to push for rent control. I think we have to push for just cause evictions, which prevent landlords, especially big landlords, to evict people for no cause whatsoever, but because they can make more money moving these people out and selling the property to a big developer. I think we need to continue to expand linkage policies, which is not too far away from the idea of reparations, but policies that say if a developer, if a big, real estate firm wants to build wherever in Boston, what are you going to give back given the externalities that will result from that development, like transportation, childcare, jobs, business opportunities for people of color. I think getting back to the idea of zoning, and this is something that we're pushing for in a big way in Boston, and I don't know how successful we'll be, but zoning has to be conjoined with fair housing. The zoning ordinance in Boston was established in 1956. Fair Housing Act comes into play in 1968. Today, you will find very little reference in our vast zoning ordinances and codes, very little reference to fair housing, inequality, inequities, racism, segregation, if at all. And so a political tool that we really need at the local level is to say, zoning has to reflect fair housing. And all that means is the developer can't come into a community and say, I would just want to build and we're going to make some profits and we're going to build these apartments and everything is going to be fine. No, we want to know what the impact of that proposal is going to be on everything our fair housing laws say at the national and state level should be adhered to. What's the impact on elderly homeowners? What's the impact on what's the impact on homelessness? And so until we can conjoin zoning and fair housing, well, let me put it this way: if we're successful in conjoining zoning and fair housing, I think that's going to emerge as a very powerful political tool that could be used to not only assuage the continuing impacts of historical redlining, but also to ensure that displacement and gentrification is minimized as much as possible.
I definitely agree with your sentiment about helping young people who may have been in the court system and the legal system because of, small amounts of marijuana. But when I talk about reparations, I'm really focusing on descendants of slaves. And when I use the term slaves, I'm not talking about just chattel slavery. As we talked about earlier in the discussion, redlining, gentrification, being ran out of neighborhoods, mass incarceration, the Homestead Acts, not being able to take advantage of land, et cetera. There's a lot of reasons that put black people in a position to where reparations is, I believe, the only way to lessen the wealth gap. And when I talk about reparations, I want to see what you have to say about some of my suggestions because a lot of politicians get nervous when we talk about cash payouts, but I think it's necessary. So what do you think about production machinery and land? Access to city and government contracts, like we talked about earlier. Getting discounts on city-owned property so that we could build up an economic and business district. What do you think about some of those suggestions?
I think those are the very ideas. So I think those are the very ideas that will actually improve the economic productivity of cities for everyone. And so when we look at investing in those communities that we have historically disinvested in, and they're predominated by black people and people of color, descendants of slaves, that makes economic sense to me. So it's not just about, we're sorry, so here's some money. No, it's not about that. It's about, this is the only way forward, economically speaking, given the U.S. economy at this point. Basic income. What basic income will do is, one, provide an infusion of dollars into people's hands that will know best how to use their income for their families and for their future, versus setting up bureaucracies that will say, well, you need to come to us for this pittance, and we're going to tell you how you could use it or not use it. We have some slight vestiges of what you're suggesting, but we haven't gone all the way. For example, we used to have empowerment zones. And the justification for empowerment zone was not a reparations justification, but the model is something that might be very useful as we think about reparations. We know which communities have been disenfranchised, disinvested, exploited, redlined. And so now the only thing is we have to also ensure that the benefits of those kind of strategies do not feed into this racial hierarchy and class hierarchy that I mentioned earlier in our discussion. And so we also need mechanisms to ensure that this benefits people who is intended for.
I definitely believe there should be some constraints on it, but I definitely want to assert the importance of this has not just been private industry discriminated against black people. As we talked about, it's been the government. So if the government has been dedicated to redlining and not allowing contracts to be allocated towards businesses that are that need the infusion of capital, if that's the case, then we should be able to get reparations from a legal standpoint as well. So to compensate, that's the theme of justice that I talked about earlier, compensating and helping the people that need the most help.
Right. And I think we have enough information today, enough evidence to identify actual, urban areas that have been exploited over the years. There's a whole genre of literature on how black communities emerged in America, and some of this was captured by the recent book by Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law. And this literature completely shows the role of government and the private sector, and also violence, but also the role of government in perpetuating racial inequality and racial hierarchy.
Yeah, so I'm definitely requesting the government to give us reparations to help us get out of our situation. Do you have any books or any other articles that you would like to suggest to us to get some more information about some of these topics?
Not books, but and you mentioned the article that I did for the Trotter Institute, Gentrification as Anti-Local Economic Development. There's another report which people can get from my website, which was based on a community participatory model on gentrification in Roxbury, and it's gentrification and community voices. And we put that together about 2 years ago. We got a little bit of foundation funding for that, but we were able to pull some hard data together to show what's happening to land and space in this predominantly black community in Boston called Roxbury. But we also talked and met with a group of community activists, neighborhood activists, to get their ideas about how to respond to this local situation where people are being displaced. And by the way, displacement is the fear of displacement is also a problem, because fear of displacement generates stress, especially among children in these, in some households that feel they're not sure where they're going to be living next or where they can afford to live. But that might be a report that people might find useful in terms of their own situation and how they want to maybe look at this and tap the voices of grassroots people involved with grassroots struggles.
So it's the Tufts University webpage with all your articles.
Yes,
and
right. So
selected papers.
Right. And there's one there, Gentrification and Community Voices. And so that might be
perfect.
That might be, and plus again at the end we have at the end of that report we were able to put together a sort of map. That's not really a map, a reference of the kinds of policies and political actions that people can think about. Again, this is Boston, Massachusetts context, but it may be relevant to other places as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you for your time. I really appreciate your research, and it was really helpful.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad that was of some help, and I'm glad that you're doing this and getting this kind of information out.
Perfect. I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Alonso. Have a nice day.
All right, you too.
Okay.
Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay up to date for more videos by clicking the bell notification icon and following our social media. For any of the people, groups, companies, or videos that were referenced in this video, don't forget to check the description and or the pinned comment section. The Question Lane, solving problems through the process of questions and answers.